So I'd like to ask you all to consider the following facts about the current state of our world. Our civilization is changing the climate of our planet. People kill themselves and others in the name of God. Species are going extinct at a rate not seen for 65 million years. 1 billion people go hungry every day. We make astonishing advances in technology, yet our world is careening ever faster out of control. And meanwhile, people everywhere are searching for spiritual meaning to their lives. What connects these seemingly unrelated phenomena? I'm proposing in this presentation that there is an overriding dynamic driving all these global imbalances. It's so fundamental to our lives that we don't even realize it exists. It's what I call the tyranny of the prefrontal cortex over other aspects of our consciousness. And I've come to believe that acknowledging this tyranny is the first step towards reorienting our prefrontal cortex, or PFC, towards a more integrated role in our consciousness. So let's just spend a moment on the PFC itself. It's at the very front of the brain. It's far more developed in humans than in other animals, and it mediates those parts of our cognition that are uniquely human, such as symbolic thought, conceptualizing, planning, creating abstractions. It's also responsible for controlling our physiological drives and for imposing meaning on things. But of course, it's not the PFC itself that's tyrannical. The PFC can be viewed as the absolute pinnacle of 4 billion years of evolution on this earth, as the biological breakthrough that's enabled a symbolic consciousness to develop on our planet for the first time in its history. So it's not the PFC itself we'll be looking at, but how we've used, or perhaps misused, its powers. And those powers of the PFC begin with the conceptualizations that it mediates. Those ideas, values, goals, plans, hopes, and meaning that collectively lead to what we know as culture, which can be understood as essentially a networked, external PFC, or symbolic consciousness, the ever-evolving aggregation of our collective symbols, values, and ideas. And that's what this presentation will be examining, using an approach that may be called a cognitive history of humanity, which understands our cultural evolution in terms of the ever-increasing empowerment of the PFC's functions over the rest of human consciousness. It identifies certain cognitive universals emerging in prehistory, and then looks at some cultural specific divergences in the past 2,500 years. It begins with the fact that because of the PFC, humans are unique in having dual forms of consciousness. A conceptual consciousness, all that stuff mediated by the PFC, and then an animate consciousness. Those parts of our lived experience that we share with other mammals, such as hunger, sexual urges, pain, fear, aggression, desire for warmth, caring for our offspring. But over the past few thousand years, cultural changes shifted the balance between these two forms of consciousness so that it began to look more like this, where conceptual consciousness has been elevated over animate consciousness. We think of the PFC-mediated functions like reason, abstraction, willpower, and transcendence as higher qualities, while animate functions like primary emotions, instincts, and sexual drive have been relegated to baser instincts. Now, this shift happened over a number of stages in history, and they were punctuated with some key inflection points, which I'm going to show you in this chart. You'll see that time is on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis, we'll be looking at the increasing levels of PFC domination over the rest of human consciousness. So the first inflection point occurred about 250,000 years ago, when what anthropologists call our social brains began to develop the capacity to think in symbols, leading to the emergence of language. Then around 50,000 years ago, we see some stirrings of the PFC's power with the first cave paintings, the emergence of art, music, and long-distance trade, and a rise in a mythic consciousness with the worldwide spread of shamanism. It was about 10,000 years ago that the PFC began its ascendancy to power with the rise of agriculture, leading to new concepts of property and hierarchies, specialized skills like writing, and massive organized projects such as irrigations and temples, leading eventually to the rise of cities and empires. And then, roughly 2,000 years ago, a dramatic split took place between Western civilization and the rest of the world, with the dualistic thought of the ancient Greeks, which then led to monotheism, the first systematic dualistic cosmology. Now let's just take a closer look at the moment of that fateful split. Around 500 BC, for the first time in human history, the Greeks came up with a unique notion that there is an abstract and eternal dimension of the universe, which is the ultimate source of value and meaning. And imprisoned within the human body, an immortal soul exists, which through the reasoning power of the PFC connects us with that eternal value and meaning. So, remembering our dual human consciousness from before, what the ancient Greeks did was to equate our conceptual consciousness with the soul and our animate consciousness with the body. And only our soul is connected with the transcendent meaning of the universe, while our body becomes just another part of the material world. This was the coup of the ancient Greeks, to see the PFC as the source of the immortal soul, as the connection with the eternal dimension of the universe. This dualistic approach to the universe set the stage for the final step to PFC tyranny, the scientific revolution in Europe. With Descartes, the dualism of the Greeks was transformed into our modern mind-body dualism. Reductionism became the basis for scientific inquiry, and the natural world was now seen as a resource for human conquest and domination. In the words of that great prophet of the scientific age, Francis Bacon, we could establish and extend the power of dominion of the human race itself over the universe, and render ourselves the masters and possessors of nature. And we succeeded beyond Bacon's wildest dreams. Here is just one out of countless examples of our dramatic success, a graph showing the accuracy of time measurement over history, which began improving exponentially around Bacon's time, from an era of more than a minute a day to less than 100 millionth of a second per day. Now, this transformative explosion of technology led to another exponential curve, the rise in world population of humans, which in turn leads to other more disturbing exponential curves, such as the unsustainable amount of carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere, causing global climate change. How did the PFC's rise in power get so exponential? The answer lies in the ratcheting effect of culture. If we go back in time to the evolution of Homo sapiens, we see that the PFC's patterning instinct led to early symbolic thought, which in turn encouraged increased PFC usage in early humans. This led eventually to the emergence of language, which caused each individual's PFC to become more networked, both within the brain and with other PFCs in the community. This led to the development of that powerful network of symbols comprising a culture, the external PFC, which then leveraged each individual's PFC to learn from infancy how to dominate the animate consciousness within and the natural world without, leading finally to the exponential impact of technology causing our present dynamic. Now, I see our PFC-powered human takeoff as something like a satellite that's been launched with wobbly controls, which can ultimately lead to one of only 3 scenarios. We could leave the Earth behind, which some people talk about in terms of the so-called singularity, the moment when computers become even more intelligent than humans. Essentially, the PFC evolving itself completely away from its human origins. Or, what many people see as more likely, we could crash and burn as we relentlessly use the Earth's dwindling resources to fuel our exponential growth. Or, we could somehow find a stable, sustainable orbit. Now, I suspect that most of you, just like me, would prefer this scenario. But how do we get there? Sustainability requires a new inflection point to a PFC 5. But what would that stage of human development look like in terms of the PFC's relation to human consciousness? How can the PFC go from tyrant to conductor? Now, this is a challenge that Gregory Bateson framed when he wrote that so much of Occidental thinking is shaped on the premise of transcendent deity that it is difficult for many people to rethink their theories in terms of immanence. The spiritual traditions of Asia offer ways to integrate the PFC's powers. The Zen practice of simply being present, the mindfulness arising from meditation, and the Taoist notion of wu wei, or effortless action. But it's in modern science that we can find hints of a true PFC-5 worldview. Findings in systems biology and complexity science invalidate the PFC-4 reductionist cosmology. We learn that all living entities are complex, self-organized, dynamical systems, that interactions between things are more important than the things themselves, that no system is autonomous, but continually interacting with other systems. There are no fixed equilibria, only continually shifting states of relative stability. And occasional phase transitions lead to the emergence of new forms of complexity. In the PFC5 worldview, the explanatory principle of life is not mechanical reductionism, but self-organization and emergence. The relation between the material and spiritual is not dualism, but is defined by integrated dynamics. And the source of spiritual value and meaning is not transcendence, but the dynamic connectivity between all living things. So the human relationship to the natural world goes from being one of domination to one of guidance, sustainability, mutual support. And what the natural world means to us is no longer a resource to utilize, but a source of material and spiritual nourishment. And the self is no longer seen as a separate, fixed, autonomous entity, but as something connected, fluid, interactive. And the PFC goes from being a tyrant in consciousness to being a conductor, an integrator, a guide. So thank you. And for anyone interested, I'm writing a book on this subject called Ecology Towards an Integration of Science and Meaning, where I go into more detail about the tyranny and the opportunities of that PFC5 worldview. And you can check my progress on my website or email me for more information. Thank you.